As you read the final chapters in Joshua, especially chapters 15 through 19, I hope you appreciated the detail the author included in those verses. The chapters outlined the geographic tribal boundaries for each allocation on the west side of the Jordan. In many instances, the names of towns and cities inherited by the tribes were given. Please note that there was a lot of detail about the allocation for Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin, but the borders for the other tribes were given in more general terms. Now, open the PowerPoint presentation that accompanies this lesson. The first slide after the introductory slide is a map showing the general location of each of the tribes. Although different Bible atlases will adjust the borders slightly, you should know where each tribe settled. This will be important later in your study of the Bible, especially in the period of the divided kingdom, and also to better understand verses such as Isaiah 9:1 and Matthew 4 verses 13 and 15. Now take some time to study the PowerPoint map, or another such map in a good Bible atlas. Let me now briefly examine each of the chapters 15 through 19. We'll start with chapter 15, the territory of Judah. The borders are given in verses 1 through 12. However, look at verse 13. The author comments specifically on the allocation given to Caleb. We looked at chapter 14 in the previous lesson and why Caleb was to be given a special piece of land around Hebron. Now here in chapter 15, verses 13 through 19, the author described again how Caleb drove out the three sons of Anak and gave their names. Anak is a biblical expression that referred to the Canaanite people who lived in and around Hebron. Anak was the son of Arba, the founder of Kiriath Arba, the city better known as Hebron. All biblical references agree that the descendants of Anak were tall or even of gigantic size. The plural form of Anak is Anakim. Although I did not point this out in an earlier lesson, verses 21 through 23 of chapter 11 stated that Joshua defeated the Anakim except in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Therefore, it is possible that Goliath, who was from Gath, the giant who David confronted, was a descendant of Anak too. But returning to Caleb in chapter 15, the Anak were still living in Kiriath Arba, and some were descendants of the three Anakim named in verse 14. I believe the names are given here because the three were undoubtedly descendants of three Anakim Caleb encountered when he scouted the land for Moses, and those names are listed in Numbers 13. Now, Caleb urged his followers to attack Kiriath Arba, or Hebron, and promised that the soldier who captured it would be allowed to marry Caleb's daughter, Achsah. Othniel, a close relative of Caleb, captured Hebron and married Achsah. After their marriage, and as the family settled into the region, Achsah asked her father, Caleb, for access to some water springs. So the Bible reported she was given the upper and lower springs. An archaeological site not far from Hebron, by the name of Rebud, is known to have been occupied at the time of Joshua. Interestingly, 2 wells have been found at Rebud that have the names the upper and lower wells. Because of the similarity of names in the Hebrew, the 2 springs in Rebud's location near Hebron, many scholars believe that Rebud was ancient Debir. Before we leave chapter 15, we must note verse 63 that stated the Judahites could not drive out the inhabitants of Jerusalem. This is a curious statement, since Jebus, or Jerusalem, was clearly in the tribal allocation of Benjamin, as we will read in verse 28 of chapter 17. Why this city was of concern to the Judahites is not very clear. Go now to the next slide of the PowerPoint presentation. On this chart, I have compiled the prophecies of Jacob as recorded in Genesis 49 and Moses in Deuteronomy 35. As Jacob lay dying, he summoned his sons and told them, in poetic form, what would happen to their future descendants. Genesis 49 is remarkable. In many instances, it accurately described where the various tribes would settle. Find Judah on the chart, and let's take that tribe as an example. Jacob told Judah he would receive the first share, and indeed his descendants did, in spite of the fact that Judah was not the firstborn son. Reuben was. Or he was not the firstborn son of Joseph. That was Manasseh. Further, as we know from the New Testament, it was in Judah that the Messiah, or ruler of the nations, was to be born. Jacob's prophecy will come true. The next chapter, 16, is short, and in it the territorial allocation of Ephraim is identified. Ephraim was given land prior to his brother Manasseh, who really was Joseph's firstborn, but that fills another of Jacob's prophecies. In verse 10, observe that Ephraim was unable to drive out the Canaanites too, especially in Gezer. Chapter 17 dealt with Manasseh, and, as we mentioned before, he was the firstborn of Joseph. Verse 1 clarified the situation on the east side of the Jordan where, you remember, Moses allowed part of the tribe of Manasseh to settle. Machir, the firstborn of Manasseh, was allotted the region east of the Jordan, geographic regions called Gilead and Bashan. An interesting development is reported in verses 3 and 4. Women, daughters of a Manassite man, Zelophehad, approached Joshua and the chief priest Eleazar. The women requested a land allocation for them, just as the other families who had sons had received. Since Zelophehad had no sons, his daughters had not received an apportionment. Based on their argument that the Lord had told Moses to distribute the land to all the families, Joshua recognized the inequality of the situation and gave the daughters of Zelophehad land also. This, by the way, has a lot to say to critics who claim women in the Bible are not equally treated. The remaining verses listed some of the towns that fell into Manasseh's allocation and identified Manasseh's borders. But verses 12 and 13 strike an ominous tone, and it is a continuation of what was said about the Ephraimites. That is, the Manassites now could not take possession of the cities, and the Canaanites lived in the land with them. The author observed that even after the Manassites became strong, they did not defeat or expel the Canaanites. Rather, they used the Canaanites for forced labor. Verses 14 to the end of the chapter are very sad. The two Joseph tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, confronted Joshua and claimed that their allocations were insufficient for their large numbers. The verses imply the tribes had not even tried to enter the hill country, but had remained in the valleys where they encountered the chariot armies of the Canaanites. Tough Joseph did not acquiesce to their complaints. In response, he ordered them to move into the forested hills and settle there. Then they were to drive out the Canaanites from their territory, even if the Canaanites had iron chariots. Unfortunately, as we have already learned from this chapter and the preceding ones, contrary to God's direction, the Canaanites continued to live among the people of Israel. Now, having identified the tribe of Judah and the Joseph tribes and where they were to settle, chapter 18 begins with two important sentences. First, the verse reported that the Israelites moved the tent of meeting from Gilgal to Shiloh. The tent of meeting was a tabernacle, along with the Ark of the Covenant. Interesting, the tabernacle was to remain in Shiloh until the time of the prophet Samuel. Go to the next PowerPoint slide and locate Shiloh. It is clear that Shiloh was in the tribal central part of the country. It's just 10 miles or 16 kilometers south of Shechem and it's in the tribal allocation of Ephraim. It might also be well to note here that Joshua was an Ephraimite. The location of the tabernacle in the central part of the country, an area that was secure, meant that the tabernacle was easily accessible from all over the land, an important feature since the Lord had directed the Israelites to celebrate 3 festivals where the tabernacle was located. In the second sentence of verse 2, the author reminded the reader there were still 7 tribes who had not received an allocation. Urging the Israelites to hurry and settle the land, Joshua asked that 3 men from each tribe be appointed to survey the land, write a description of it, divide it into 7 parcels, and return to him at Shiloh. Once the land had been surveyed and 7 parcels identified, Joshua told the Israelites he would cast the lots before God and apportion the land between the remaining 7 tribes. The first lot fell to Benjamin, and their border is described as being between Judah and the Joseph tribe of Ephraim. The cities that were in Benjamin were also noted, and you should recognize in verse 28 that Jebus, also known as Jerusalem, was listed as being in Benjamin. Return now to the PowerPoint slide of Jacob and Moses' prophecies and find Benjamin. Moses prophesied in Deuteronomy 33:12 that the beloved of the Lord rests in safety. The high God surrounds him all day long. The beloved rests between his shoulders. Benjamin, you may recall, was the son of Jacob, whom he greatly loved. Moses' prophecy in Deuteronomy 33 predicted Benjamin would settle between the protective shoulders, and from the map, Benjamin is between the shoulders of Judah and Joseph's sons. In chapter 19, we find the next lot went to Simeon. Find Simeon on the prophecy chart. Oh, Jacob was not so kind to Simeon or his brother Levi. Levi and Simeon sinned at Shechem, and when they murdered the Shechemite men after they had been circumcised. As a result, Jacob threatened that those 2 tribes were to be scattered, one in Judah and one throughout Israel. Now return to the PowerPoint map and locate Simeon, and note that it is scattered in the tribal allocation of Judah. And we'll return to Levi in a minute. Next, Zebulun received its portion, then Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. Their allocations are described very succinctly. Locate Dan along the coast on the PowerPoint map. Later in the book of Judges, you will read that Dan decided that occupying territory along the coast was too difficult, so elements of the tribe moved to the northern part of the country to a city they conquered called Lashem. The Danites renamed the city Dan. A detailed discussion of the problems this move caused is in the book of Judges, but it is also briefly stated here in verse 47 of chapter 19. Finally, verses 49 and 50 of chapter 19 reported that Joshua received Timnath-Serah, a city in Ephraimite territory and in the middle of the country. Turn now to chapter 20. This chapter is a discussion of the location of the cities of refuge. Having distributed the land to the tribes, the Lord provided an elementary system of government, specifically a system of regional courts to deal with capital offenses having to do with manslaughter. Thus, the most inflammatory of cases was removed from local jurisdiction, and a safeguard was created against the easy miscarriage of justice, with its potential for endless blood feuds, when retribution for manslaughter was left in the hands of family members. The cities chosen were among those also assigned to the Levites, where ideally the law of Moses would be especially known and honored. These cities were places where a person who had committed manslaughter or unintentional murder could flee, and the avenger of blood, he's listed in verses 3 and 5, would not be able to execute retribution, that is, kill them. There the person could stay until the death of the high priest, after which he could return to his town. In verses 7 and 8, the cities are identified. Now turn to the next PowerPoint slide. I have identified the 6 cities of refuge. Note that they are very carefully located, 3 on each side of the Jordan River. Also note how geographically dispersed they are on each side of the Jordan. One is in the north, one is in the center of the country, and one is in the south. On the next 4 PowerPoint slides, I have summarized the rationale for the blood avenger in the Old Testament. Please read these charts carefully, and I believe they will help you understand a very difficult and perhaps unpleasant aspect of life in Old Testament times. Now please turn to the next set of 3 slides and also read them carefully. Look up the Bible passages as I have contrasted the concept of the cities of refuge and our refuge in Jesus Christ. These 2 sets of charts, the one outlining the concept of a blood avenger, and the other how cities of refuge are a precursor of our refuge in Christ, are very significant to your understanding of the background of the necessity for blood sacrifices. May God bless you as you study these significant aspects of the book of Joshua. Return now to the Bible and look at chapter 21. It is a lengthy and detailed list of the 48 cities and towns that were given to the tribe of Levi. Levi, unlike his brother Simeon, had achieved favor in God's eyes at Mount Sinai as recorded in Genesis chapter 32, verses 27 and 29. As a result, they were to be scattered throughout Israel rather than lose their identity by being mixed among another tribe as was Simeon. Look at the next PowerPoint slide, a map on which all 48 Levitical cities are shown. Indeed, they were scattered, but scattered for a purpose. If you were to study this chapter in great detail, you would discover that the towns are not just randomly listed. There is great order in the distribution. You would find that each of the Levitical families was given an approximate equal number of cities. The Kohathites, for example, the family who were to attend to the tabernacle, were given cities in the vicinity of Jerusalem where, in the future, the temple would be built. Each of the other tribal allocations had representatives of the Levitical families. Now go to the next PowerPoint slide on which I have detailed the distribution of the Levitical cities. It is really quite a remarkable chapter, and the detail therein is revealing of how God's hand was assuring his people that they were not far from the influence of God's priests, who were to be the Levites. Chapter 21 concludes with 3 very encouraging messages. 1, quote, "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to their ancestors that he would give them, and having taken possession of it, they settled there." In verse 44, "And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands." And now verse 45, "Not one of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass." These verses are a very fitting summary of what the book of Joshua represents. It is a book that reveals God's faithfulness, how God honors his word, and how God cares for his people even when they are confronted with seemingly overwhelming obstacles and adversaries. All God's promises will come to pass. Since the work of overpowering the principal Canaanite armies was completed, and the land was divided among the Israelites so that they could clear the land and settle, in chapter 22 Joshua summoned to Shiloh the 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. These tribes had fought faithfully with Joshua during the years of the conquest. Now their work was finished, and as he had promised, when their job was done, Joshua would bless them and send them away. But as the 2.5 tribes traveled west towards their homes and approached the Jordan River, they constructed a large altar. As we learn in later verses, the 2.5 tribes built this altar not as a place for offering or sacrifices, but as a memorial of what God had done for all the tribes. This was the sixth mention of large stones being used as a form of memorial or reminder mentioned in the book of Joshua. The others are at chapter 4, verses 1-9, chapter 4, verse 20, chapter 7, verse 26, chapter 8, verse 29, chapter 8, verse 32, and chapter 10, verse 27. Unfortunately, when the tribal leaders who remained west of the Jordan River learned of the altar, they suspected apostasy and accused the 2.5 tribes of setting up an altar as a rival to the true altar at Shiloh. The western tribes armed themselves for war against their brother Israelites, men with whom they had just served in combat a few months before. As the army came to the Jordan, they confronted the 2.5 tribes with what they thought was their sin, and they compared their sin with that of Achan, who had taken the prohibited items at Jericho. It was a stinging rebuke. But the western tribes offered peace, and said that if the 2.5 tribes had found disfavor with the land east of the Jordan, they were welcome to share the land with them on the west. Hearing the true meaning of the altar, the western tribes were greatly relieved and returned to their homes west of the Jordan. I can relate to this story in that it so accurately reflects how often I have seen Christians criticize or make hasty assumptions about other Christians, even those with whom they have served in ministries. It is so easy to gossip and assume the intentions of others are not pleasing to God when, in fact, we do not know all the facts. May this chapter be a reminder to us of our propensity to charge others with acts that may not be true or completely accurate. Doing so is hurtful and not pleasing to God. The last 2 chapters of Joshua are the words of his final recorded speeches. He reminded the Israelites how God had fought for them and that the land had been apportioned. Now God would assist them to drive the remaining inhabitants out of the land. In so doing, he referred to what God had told him in chapter 1. Remember, be strong, do what was written in the law, and persevere. Joshua cautioned the people not to intermingle with the Canaanites, or God would not continue to bless them. And if they worshipped the idols of the people in the land, they would perish from the land. These cautions were very similar to those in previous books, such as Exodus 23:33, 34:12, and Deuteronomy 7:16. In chapter 24, we find the Israelites back at Shechem, where earlier they had heard the blessings and curses from the sides of Mount Ebal and Gerizim. Similar in tone to Moses, who had a final call for covenant renewal, that is the book of Deuteronomy, Joshua issues a call for covenant renewal to the people. He reviewed Israel's history and how God had blessed them and was faithful to them. He urged again for Israel not to be seduced by the idols of the land, of the people in the land. Then Joshua makes his great commitment of faith in chapter 24, verse 15. Now, if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, he said, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the God of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. The response of the people was overwhelming. They would serve the Lord. They would serve the Lord. Joshua then set up another memorial of a large stone, the 7th in the book, as a witness to what the people had just declared. The concluding verses of the book of Joshua record that he died at age 110 and was buried at Timnath Serah, the town that had been given to him in the tribal allocation of Ephraim. Then, interestingly, the concluding author of Joshua gave a report that bones of Joseph, whom the Israelites had taken when they left Egypt, were buried in Shechem on land that Joseph had purchased. Again, another clue that Shechem had deep and historical connections with Israel. The book of Joshua ends on a positive note. Although there are indications in the latter chapters that the Canaanites were still prevalent in the land, the people had made a commitment to God. God had given them the land, divided divided it among the tribes, made provisions for how justice would be dispensed by virtue of the cities of refuge, and promised that he, God, would be with them as they dislodged the remaining Canaanites. It is therefore with a very hopeful heart that we turn to the pages of Judges, only to be greatly disappointed at how quickly the Israelites turned from God and to the idols of the Canaanites. I pray you have learned and grown deeper in your understanding of who God is by what he has done as we have done this study. I pray you were encouraged as you studied about Rahab and the Gibeonites. Read their confessions of faith as they recognized the one true, loving God and committed to him. In response, God saved them, just as he will save us if we commit fully to him. I pray your faith was strengthened as you learned how the chapters in Joshua connected so fully with other earlier Old Testament accounts. Also, how details such as the covenant renewals at Shechem were precursors of Jesus' meeting of a woman at Jacob's well, a woman who had learned of a future Savior, and how Jesus made the final covenant renewal by his coming to save the world and stating, I am he who is coming to you. This book of Joshua deserves careful study and appreciation for its history and its linking of the first 5 books of the Bible to the rest of Scripture, New Testament and Old. I am happy to have had the time to share it with you. God bless you in your studies.